The winter of 1854 came to Belia Tishina like a curse wrapped in white. In the remote villages of Tver Oblast, where the forest stretched endless and dark between Moscow and nowhere, people learned to read the sky like scripture. That year, the clouds hung low and heavy from October through March, dropping snow that never seemed to stop falling. Katia Volkov had felt the twins moving inside her belly since the feast of St. Nicholas. 2 heartbeats where there should be 1. 2 souls where God had intended only 1 blessing. She pressed her hands against her swollen stomach and tried not to think about what the village would say, what Father Dmitri would demand. In Belia Tishina, twins were not a gift. They were a judgment. The doctrine was older than memory, older than the wooden church that stood crooked in the village center. When God sent 2 children instead of 1, it meant the family had committed some hidden sin. The earth was too cold, the harvest too thin, to feed extra mouths that carried the mark of divine displeasure. So the church took 1 child as payment. Always 1 child. The family could keep the other as a reminder of their transgression. Katia's husband Mikhail had died 3 months before the babies were born, crushed beneath a falling tree while cutting wood for the church. She buried him in ground, so frozen they had to build fires on the earth just to soften it enough for shovels. Now she lived alone in their small cabin at the edge of the village, surviving on charity and the few kopecks she earned washing clothes in water so cold it cracked her knuckles until they bled. The babies came on a night when the wind howled through the gaps in the cabin walls like wolves. Katia labored alone, biting down on a leather strap to keep from screaming. When the first daughter emerged, small and blue-lipped but breathing, Katia felt a moment of relief. 1 child. Normal. Blessed. Then the second baby followed, and Katia's heart broke like ice. Both daughters were perfect. Both had Mikhail's dark hair and her own green eyes. Both cried with voices that sounded like tiny bells. Katia wrapped them in the only blanket she owned and held them against her chest, feeling their heartbeats flutter like trapped birds. Outside, the snow fell heavier. By morning, the news had spread through Belia Tishina like smoke. Old Vera, who helped with difficult births, had seen both babies. She told her daughter, who told the baker, who told Father Dmitri during morning prayers. Before the sun climbed above the tree line, 3 men stood at Katia's door. Father Dmitri was tall and thin, with eyes the color of winter ice. His black robes made him look like a shadow against the white world. Beside him stood Elder Petrov, whose family had lived in Belia Tishina longer than anyone could remember. The third man was young Alexei, who served as the church's strong arm when persuasion was not enough. Katia Volkova, Father Dmitri said, his breath forming clouds in the frozen air. We must speak. She let them in because she had no choice. They filled her small cabin, making it feel even smaller. The babies slept in a wooden crate that Mikhail had planned to use for storing potatoes. Father Dmitri looked at them with the expression of a man examining livestock at market. 2 daughters, he said. God's judgment is clear. Elder Petrov nodded, stroking his gray beard. He had been present when this same scene played out in other homes, with other families. The doctrine is ancient, Katia. It protects the village. When God sends twins, 1 belongs to him. They're both mine, Katia whispered. Both my children. 1 is yours, Father Dmitri corrected. The other belongs to the church, to God's service. You know this. Your grandmother knew this when her own twin sisters were born in 1798. Katia had heard the story. Her grandmother had given up her twin sister to the church. The child had vanished behind the monastery walls, never to be seen again. The family had prospered afterward, her grandmother always said. The remaining sister had married well and lived a long life. The doctrine worked. The village survived. But those were just stories. These were her daughters. Choose, Elder Petrov said simply. You have until dawn. The men left, and Katia was alone again with her sleeping babies. She lifted them from their makeshift bed and held them, studying their faces in the dim light from the small window. How could she choose between them? They were identical, both perfect, both hers. One had been born first by only minutes. Did that matter? Should that matter? She tried to feed them, but her milk was thin from hunger and fear. The babies fussed and cried, their small voices echoing in the empty cabin. Outside, the wind continued to howl, rattling the loose boards and sending cold air through every crack. Katia thought about running. She could wrap the babies warmly, pack what little food she had, and disappear into the forest. But where would she go? It was 200 miles to the nearest city, and the roads were impassable with snow. She would freeze to death within a day, and the babies with her. She thought about refusing, simply telling Father Dmitri that she would keep both children, doctrine or no doctrine. But the church controlled everything in Belia Tishina. The food distribution, the firewood allocation, the small jobs that kept people alive through the long winters. Without the church's blessing, she and both babies would starve. Night fell early, as it always did in winter. Katia lit her single candle and sat beside the window, watching the snow continue to fall. The village was silent except for the wind. No lights showed in the other cabins. Everyone was inside, warm and safe with their single children, their normal families, their clear consciences. She began to sing, very softly, a lullaby her mother had sung to her. The babies stirred and settled, comforted by her voice. Katia sang the same song over and over, watching their small faces in the candlelight, memorizing every detail. Which one should she give up? The firstborn, who had emerged into the world ahead of her sister, or the second, who had followed close behind like a shadow? They looked so alike she could barely tell them apart. When one cried, the other joined in. When one slept, the other grew restless. They belonged together. But by morning, they would be apart forever. Katia continued singing as the night grew deeper and the snow piled higher against her windows. She sang until her voice grew hoarse and the candle burned low. She sang until she could no longer tell which tears were hers and which were melting snow from the warm glass. Dawn was still hours away, but already she could feel it coming like a judgment. Soon Father Dmitri would return, and she would have to place one of her daughters into his cold hands. She would have to watch him carry her child away to whatever fate awaited behind the monastery walls. The snow had not stopped falling, and somehow Katia knew it would not stop until her choice was made. Dawn came to Belia Tishina like a thief, stealing away Katia's last moments with both her daughters. When Father Dmitri returned, his boots crunching through the fresh snow, Katia had made her choice in the way that no mother should ever have to choose. She gave him the second-born, the one who had followed her sister into the world like a whispered prayer. The baby made no sound as Father Dmitri wrapped her in his black cloak. She simply stared up at Katia with those green eyes that matched her own, as if she understood that this was goodbye. Katia pressed her lips to the child's forehead one last time, memorizing the smell of her skin, the weight of her small body. "She will serve God well," Father Dmitri said, but his words sounded hollow in the cold morning air. Then they were gone, and Katia was left with one daughter and a silence so deep it felt like drowning. 3 miles away, behind the stone walls of St. Sergius Monastery, Sister Marfa heard the familiar sound of Father Dimitri's boots echoing through the corridors. She had been expecting him. The news of twin births always reached the monastery before the babies themselves did. She dried her hands on her rough brown habit and prepared to receive another small soul into the house of silent prayers. Sister Marfa had served at St. Sergius for 23 years, ever since she was 16, and her own family had given her to the church to settle a debt. She had learned to find peace in the daily routines of prayer and service. But lately, that peace felt as fragile as spring ice. The monastery held 47 children. All of them were twins given to the church according to the Tver Doctrine. All of them had been forgotten by the families who surrendered them. They ranged in age from infants to young teenagers, and they lived in a world of whispers and careful footsteps, where laughter was discouraged and questions were forbidden. Sister Marfa tended to them with a mother's heart trapped in a nun's body. She knew every child's face, every small fear, every dream they dared to voice in the darkness. She braided the girls' hair and mended the boys' torn clothes. She held them when they cried for mothers they barely remembered. She sang lullabies in voices so soft that God himself might have wept to hear them. But there were things about St. Sergius that Sister Marfa tried not to think about. Things that happened in the basement, where Father Dimitri kept his private chambers and his locked rooms. Things that explained why some children who grew too old, too curious, too difficult, simply vanished one morning as if they had never existed at all. The new baby was beautiful, with dark hair and serious green eyes. Sister Marfa baptized her with the name Anastasia, meaning resurrection, though she knew the child would never rise from the life that had been chosen for her. She placed Anastasia in a wooden crib beside 3 other infants, all of them twins given up by families who had convinced themselves it was God's will. In the village below, Katia walked through the snow-covered streets like a woman made of glass. She carried her remaining daughter, who she had named Yelena, wrapped in the same blanket that had once held both babies. Every step felt like walking on broken bones. Every breath tasted like grief. She stopped at each house, asking questions she already knew the answers to. Had anyone seen a baby with Father Dimitri? Did anyone know where the church children lived? Could anyone tell her if her daughter was safe? The villagers looked away when she spoke. They crossed themselves and hurried inside their warm homes. They made their own choices, their own sacrifices. They did not want to be reminded of what those choices cost. Old Vera, who had helped deliver the twins, finally took pity on Katia. She invited her into her small kitchen and made tea from herbs that grew wild near the cemetery. The monastery, Vera whispered, glancing toward the door as if Father Dimitri might be listening. That's where they take the children. Behind the stone walls where nobody goes. Can I see her? Katia asked. Just once. Vera shook her head. No one has ever visited a church child. Once they cross those walls, they belong to God completely. Their earthly families are forgotten. But she's my daughter. She was your daughter, Vera corrected gently. Now she's something else. Something holy. Something separate from this world. Katia left Vera's house with Yelena crying against her chest and a desperation growing in her heart like a disease. She walked to the edge of the village, where the monastery sat on a hill surrounded by bare birch trees. The stone walls were tall and gray, topped with iron spikes that looked like thorns. No windows fast outward. No sounds escaped from within. She stood in the snow, holding Yelena, and listened for any sign of her other daughter. A cry, a laugh, even a whisper. But the monastery was silent as a tomb. Inside those walls, Sister Marfa went about her evening duties with a heavy heart. She fed the babies their thin porridge, sang the older children to sleep, and swept the long corridors that never seemed to stay clean. As night fell, she made her way to the basement to retrieve clean linens from the storage rooms. The basement of St. Sergius was a maze of stone chambers, some used for storage, others for purposes that Sister Marfa had learned not to question. She walked quickly past Father Dimitri's private study, where candlelight flickered under the door as she could hear him writing in his ledgers. Always writing, always recording, as if souls were inventory to be counted and cataloged. She passed the room where the older boys were taught to read and write, preparing them for service to the church. She passed the workshop where the girls learned to weave and sew, creating vestments and altar cloths that would outlive them all. She passed rooms she had never been allowed to enter, rooms with heavy locks and doors that felt cold even in summer. At the end of the longest corridor, Sister Marfa found what she was looking for, the linen closet filled with sheets and blankets worn thin by countless washings. As she gathered an armful of clean cloth, her foot caught on a loose stone in the floor. She knelt to examine it, thinking it might be dangerous for the children who sometimes played in these corridors. The stone was not loose. It was deliberately placed, covering something beneath. Sister Marfa pried it up with her fingernails, revealing a small cavity in the floor. Inside was a bundle of papers, wrapped in oiled cloth to protect them from moisture. Her hands shook as she opened the bundle by the light of her single candle. The papers were records, written in Father Dimitri's precise handwriting. Lists of names, dates, and brief notes. Children's names. Twin children going back decades. Anna Petrov, born 1832, received age 3 months, died of fever 1834. Pavel Smirnov, born 1835, received age 6 months, sent to Moscow 1845. Mikhail and Maria Volkov, born 1829, received age 2 years, relocated to special service 1835. Sister Marfa's blood turned to ice water. Mikhail and Maria Volkov. She knew that name. Katya's husband had been Mikhail Volkov. These must be his older siblings, twins given to the church 25 years ago. But what did relocated to special service mean? And why were some children listed as dead while others were simply gone? She flipped through more pages, finding records of children she remembered caring for, children who had vanished in the night without explanation. The records painted a picture that made her stomach turn. Some children truly did serve the church, growing up to become priests and nuns. But others simply disappeared when they became inconvenient, too expensive to feed, too curious about the world beyond the walls. And some, according to the carefully coded language in Father Dimitri's notes, served the church in ways that Sister Marfa did not want to understand. She rewrapped the papers and placed them back in their hiding place, her hands trembling so badly she could barely manage the task. As she stood, she heard footsteps echoing down the corridor. Heavy boots on stone. Father Dmitri, making his nightly rounds. Sister Marfa grabbed her linens and hurried back toward the stairs, her heart pounding like church bells. She had seen too much, learned too much. The knowledge sat in her chest like a stone, heavy and cold and impossible to ignore. Above her, in the sleeping chambers, 47 children dreamed of families they could not remember and freedoms they would never know. Little Anastasia slept in her wooden crib, unaware that her mother stood outside in the snow, calling her name into the wind. But Sister Marfa had heard that wind, and she had seen those records, and she knew that some secrets were too terrible to keep buried in the basement of a holy place. March came to Belia Tishina 3 weeks early in 1854, bringing warmth that no one expected and melting snow that had lain frozen since October. The earth, softened by the sudden thaw, began to give up secrets that winter had kept buried. Behind the monastery walls, where the ground had been consecrated and blessed for generations, the early spring revealed things that should have stayed hidden forever. Sister Marfa noticed the smell first. It rose from the monastery garden as she hung wet linens on the line, carried on the warm wind that had replaced the bitter cold. It was the smell of earth and decay, of things long buried rising to the surface. She tried to ignore it, focusing on her work, but the smell grew stronger each day. Katya had spent the winter months like a ghost walking through her own life. She cared for Yelena with hands that moved by habit rather than heart. She cooked meals she couldn't taste, spoke words she didn't mean, and slept dreams filled with the crying of a baby she couldn't reach. Every morning, she looked toward the monastery on the hill and wondered if her other daughter was still alive. The early spring brought her a desperate kind of hope. If the roads cleared, perhaps she could find a way to see inside those stone walls. Perhaps she could learn what had happened to the child she had given away. On the first warm day of March, when the snow had melted enough to reveal patches of brown earth, Katya made her decision. She bundled Yelena against her chest and walked to the monastery, not as a beggar asking for charity, but as a mother demanding to know the fate of her child. The monastery gates were tall and iron, locked tight against the world. But spring had loosened more than just the frozen ground. It had loosened the resolve of people who had kept silent too long. When Katya knocked on the small door beside the gates, it was Sister Marfa who answered. The two women looked at each other for a long moment. Sister Marfa saw a mother aged by grief, her green eyes hollow with loss. Katya saw a nun whose hands shook as she gripped the door, whose face carried the weight of too many secrets. "I know why you've come," Sister Marfa whispered, glancing over her shoulder to make sure they were alone. "Your daughter, Anastasia." The name hit Katia like a physical blow. Her child had a name. She was real. She existed somewhere behind these walls. "Is she alive?" Katia asked, though she was afraid to hear the answer. Sister Marfa nodded, tears spilling down her weathered cheeks. "She's alive. Beautiful. Growing strong." But she looked around again, then made a decision that would change everything. "Kulme, quickly, while Father Dmitri is away." She led Katia through a small door that opened into the monastery kitchen. The room smelled of cabbage and prayer candles, of lives lived in careful silence. Sister Marfa moved like someone familiar with secrets, taking Katia through corridors she had walked for 23 years. They climbed narrow stairs to the children's sleeping chambers. The room was long and filled with small beds, each one holding a child between the ages of infant and 15. They all had the same look in their eyes, a careful emptiness, as if they had learned that wanting things only brought pain. Near the window, in a crib carved from pine wood, lay a baby with dark hair and green eyes. She was awake, staring at the ceiling with the serious expression that Katia remembered. When she saw her mother's face, she smiled. Katia's knees nearly gave out. She reached into the crib and lifted her daughter, holding her against her chest for the first time in 3 months. The baby felt heavier, more solid. She had grown. She had survived. "She knows you," Sister Marfa said softly. "Sometimes she cries at night, and nothing soothes her except when I sing the lullabies mothers sing. I think she remembers." Katia pressed her face against her daughter's hair, breathing in her smell, memorizing the weight of her in her arms. Yelena, still bundled against Katia's chest, reached out with tiny fingers to touch her sister's face. For a moment, the twins were together again. But the moment couldn't last. Sister Marfa led them quickly from the sleeping chamber, down different stairs, into the basement where she had made her terrible discovery weeks earlier. "There are things you need to see," Sister Marfa said, her voice heavy with the burden of knowledge. "Things about what really happens here, about what happened to the other children." She led Katia to the hidden records, pulling up the loose stone and retrieving the wrapped bundle of papers. By the light of a single candle, she showed Katia the ledger that Father Dmitri had kept for decades. Katia's hands trembled as she read the names. Mikhail and Maria Volkov, born 1829. Her husband's twin siblings, given to the church when he was too young to remember. Listed as relocated to special service in 1835, when it would have been only 6 years old. "What does it mean?" Katia whispered. "Special service?" Sister Marfa's face was pale in the candlelight. "I've been watching, listening, trying to understand. Some children truly do serve the church. They grow up to become priests and nuns, or they work in the kitchens and gardens. But others..." She pointed to entries in the ledger, coded notes that told stories of children who had simply vanished. When they get too old, too curious, too expensive to feed, Father Dmitri decides they have served their purpose. Some are sold to labor crews heading to Siberia. Others are sent to houses in distant cities where they work as servants until they die. And some... She couldn't finish the sentence, but she led Katia to another room, one with a small window that looked out onto the monastery garden. In the early spring light, they could see what the melting snow had revealed. The garden was not just a place for growing vegetables and herbs. It was a graveyard. The warm weather had softened the earth enough to show the outlines of small graves, dozens of them, arranged in neat rows between the cabbage plants and potato beds. Some graves were marked with simple wooden crosses. Others had no markers at all. "The ones who got sick," Sister Marfa said quietly. "The ones who tried to run away. The ones who asked too many questions about their families. They're all here, under the earth where Father Dmitri grows his holy vegetables." Katia stared at the garden of graves, holding both her daughters against her chest. She thought of her husband's twin siblings, listed as relocated in the ledger. She wondered if they lay beneath those neat rows of earth, if they had been buried with prayers or with silence. "How long has this been happening?" she asked. The records go back to 1798, Sister Marfa replied. Generations of twins, given to the church by families who believed they were saving their villages. Hundreds of children who lived and died behind these walls, forgotten by everyone except God. And Father Dmitri, he believes he is doing holy work, protecting the village from God's judgment, taking the cursed children and using them for the church's purposes. In his mind, their lives belong to God, not to themselves or their families. Katia looked down at Anastasia, sleeping peacefully in her arms. Her daughter was healthy now, but what would happen when she grew older? When she began to ask questions about the world beyond these walls? Would she end up in the garden with the others, buried beneath the holy vegetables? Sister Marfa seemed to read her thoughts. I can't protect them all, she said. There are too many children, and Father Dmitri watches everything. But your daughter, she's still young, still small enough to disappear without anyone noticing. The words hung in the air between them like a bridge neither woman was sure they could cross. Outside, the spring wind rattled the small window, carrying the smell of melting earth and ancient secrets finally coming to light. What are you saying? Katia asked, though her heart already knew the answer. Sister Marfa took a deep breath, looking older than her 39 years. I'm saying that some sins are too great to bear alone, and some truths are too terrible to keep buried with the dead. The truth spread through Belia to Sheena like fire through dry wheat. Sister Marfa had made her choice in the basement of St. Sergius, looking at Katia holding her twin daughters with tears streaming down both their faces. Some secrets were too heavy for one person to carry. Some sins required the light of day to burn them clean. It began with whispers. Sister Marfa had found ways to leave the monastery grounds, carrying water buckets to the village well, gathering herbs from the forest, always with some holy purpose that Father Dmitri would approve. But her real purpose was to speak to the mothers, the women who had given up their twin children over the years, who had convinced themselves it was God's will and tried to forget the weight of empty arms. She found Elena Petrov first, the baker's wife who had surrendered her twin son 12 years earlier. Elena's remaining boy, Pavel, was now a strong lad who helped with the ovens, but his mother's eyes had never lost their haunted look. Your other son, Sister Marfa said quietly, meeting Elena behind the bakery where the smell of bread could not sweeten the bitter truth. Dmitri. He died of fever when he was 4. He's buried in the monastery garden, beneath the cabbage rows. Elena's face went white as flour. You're lying. Father Dmitri said he was serving God, that he was healthy and holy. Sister Marfa pulled out a page she had torn from Father Dmitri's ledger, risking everything to bring proof. Dmitri Petrov, born 1842, received age 6 months, died of consumption 1846. Buried in consecrated ground, row 7, unmarked grave. Elena read the words with shaking hands, then crumpled the paper against her chest and wept like she had not wept in 12 years. The sound brought her husband running from a bakery, and then the neighbors came, and soon half the village knew that the church had been lying about the fate of their children. The news reached every family that had ever given up a twin. Anna Smirnova learned that her daughter had been sold to a factory in Moscow at age 8. Mikhail Fedorov discovered that his twin boys had been sent to work in the silver mines of Siberia, where they had died before their 10th birthdays. Maria Volkova, Katia's mother-in-law, finally understood what had happened to her own twin children 50 years earlier. By evening, a crowd had gathered in the village square. Not an angry mob, but something quieter and more dangerous. A group of parents who had carried guilt and grief for years, who had suddenly learned that their sacrifices had fed nothing but cruelty. Father Dmitri appeared at the church steps, his black robes making him look like a shadow against the white stone. His face was calm, but his eyes held the cold fury of a man whose authority had been questioned. You listen to the lies of a faithless nun, he announced, his voice carrying across the square. Sister Marfa has betrayed her holy vows. She spreads poison to turn you against God's will. Show us the children. called Elena Petrov, her voice raw from crying. "If they serve God so well, let us see them. Let us know they are safe." "The church does not answer to the faithless," Father Dmitri replied. "You gave your children to God freely. What happens to them is God's business, not yours." But the crowd was no longer listening. They had heard enough lies, carried enough guilt. Old Vera stepped forward, leaning heavily on her walking stick. She was the oldest woman in Belia Tishina, the one who had delivered most of the twins, who had seen more families torn apart than anyone else. "I helped you take those babies," she said, her voice carrying in the spring air. "I believed it was holy work. But I've seen the records. I've seen the graves. God does not hide his good works in basement ledgers and unmarked graves." Father Dimitri's composure cracked. "You will all burn for this blasphemy. The church has protected this village for generations. Without the doctrine, God's judgment will fall on every family." "God's judgment has already fallen," Katia said, stepping out of the crowd with both her daughters in her arms. Yelena slept against her shoulder, while Anastasia stared at the crowd with curious green eyes. It fell on every mother who gave away her child. It fell on every father who convinced himself it was necessary. It fell on every village that chose fear over love. The sight of Katia holding both twins sent a shock through the crowd. How had she gotten a second child back? How had she defied the doctrine that had ruled their lives for so long? Sister Marfa appeared beside her, still wearing her brown habit, but no longer looking like a woman bound by vows. "I brought her daughter out," she announced, "and I'll bring out every child who can still be saved. The doctrine ends tonight." Father Dmitri raised his hand as if to strike her, but the crowd pressed closer. Now they saw him clearly for the first time. "The monastery," someone called from the back of the crowd. "Show us what's in the monastery." They moved as one body up the hill, through the bare birch trees, to the stone walls that had hidden so many secrets. The iron gates were locked, but the crowd had brought axes and hammers, tools meant for building but strong enough for tearing down. Inside the monastery, the 47 children heard the sound of breaking metal and raised voices. They huddled in their dormitory, afraid and confused. They'd been taught that the outside world was dangerous, that only the church could protect them. Now the outside world was coming to them. Sister Marfa led the way through the corridors she knew so well, bringing the parents to see their children who were still alive. Reunions happened in whispers and tears. A mother recognized her son's eyes after 8 years apart. A father saw his daughter smile and remembered why he had wept the day she was taken. But there were other discoveries, too. The basement rooms where older children had been kept in conditions no animal should endure. The workshop where small hands had sewn vestments until they bled. The private chambers where Father Dmitri had kept his detailed records of every cruelty, every small life crushed under the weight of his twisted faith. The crowd found the garden with its rows of unmarked graves. They found the ledger that recorded decades of suffering. They found letters from buyers in distant cities, treating children like livestock to be sold. They found evidence of every sin that had been hidden behind holy words and sacred walls. Father Dmitri tried to flee, but the crowd was everywhere. They cornered him in his study, surrounded by his careful records and his collected wealth. He was not killed. The people of Belia Tishina were not murderers, despite their rage. But he was stripped of his robes, his authority, his power to hurt anyone else. The monastery burned that night, not from malice, but from necessity. Some places hold too much pain to be allowed to stand. The flames climbed high into the spring sky, visible for miles across the forests of Tver Oblast. The church bells rang one last time as the bell tower caught fire, sending their bronze voices across the landscape in a final, mournful song. By morning, the children were safe in the homes of families who had never stopped loving them, even when they tried to forget. The survivors of Father Dimitri's doctrine began the slow work of healing. The dead were given proper burials, with names carved in wooden crosses and flowers planted on their graves. Katia walked home through the ashes and the morning mist, carrying both her daughters in her arms. Yelena and Anastasia slept peacefully, finally together where they belonged. The village was quiet behind her, but it was a different kind of quiet now. Not the silence of fear and hidden shame, but the stillness of people who had finally stopped running from the truth. Spring had come early to Belia, Tashina, melting the winter ice and revealing what had been buried too long in frozen ground. But some seasons of the heart take longer to change, and forgiveness, for others and for themselves, would come slowly to those who had learned to live with necessary lies. But some seasons of the heart take longer to change, and forgiveness, for others and for themselves, would come slowly to those who had learned to live with necessary lies.